So we finished last week, and I had been debating whether I wanted to spend a whole lot more time on the Inquisition. What we're going to do, rather than going back to the Inquisition and sort of hearing more stories about torture and death, is that we're going to save our budget of stories of torture and death and persecution of that type for other periods of time, because there certainly were. We have pogroms to cover still, particularly the pogrom that launched all of them. Okay, so where we're going to pick up today is after the little review we did of the places that Jews had gone, and we've still got many, many more places to cover. But first, we're going to return to Central Europe, because we want to meet someone there and to understand a little bit about the effect of the Protestant Reformation on the Jewish community. Now, you would think with a church that had been persecuting, or at least participating on official and unofficial bases, the persecution of Jews, much more official in Spain and in Portugal, much less official and even somewhat protective in other parts of Europe, but faced with hordes of people who nevertheless were chasing Jews all around the country in some cases. France, remember, had 4 separate expulsions. If you include Provence, I was teaching something on Saturday morning, or I'm going to this week, for those of you who want to join me on our Shabbat class, where we're going to learn something about a little controversy about Maimonides that arose. It's not an anti-Semitic thing. And then I realized, wow, there was a whole 4th expulsion I had forgotten about, because the Jews in Provence stayed there until the early 15th century. So those Jews were on the run a lot, whereas England just did it once. Germany did it several times, back and forth. And you can't even really say anything unified about Germany, because Germany was not a unified country. It was an extraordinarily split up country. I don't remember, somebody once told me this extraordinary number of little duchies and every other kind of city-state and semi-kingdom and kingdom that they had going on there before the unification. But I do want to stop on our little journey here, and we're never in complete chronological order, to take a look just very briefly at the Protestant Reformation. Because, again, it would lead you to think that maybe there was an opening here for things to get better for the Jews, just as you would think the Enlightenment would too. And it did, but not before creating a lot of identity crises for Jews that one could say are part of the anti-Semitic experience. So without turning you into experts in Christianity or making you learn about the 30-year war or any of that, because that's not fun, unless you really like that kind of thing. We're just going to look at one guy and a few of the things that happened in the 50 years or so around him, because I want you to read something he wrote and understand how he viewed Jews. And that would be Martin Luther, not to be confused with the Martin Luther King Jr. This is the white Martin Luther, who lived in Wittenberg, Germany, and was a very major critic of the Catholic Church, to which he belonged, and was a clergy, as we would say today. On October 31st of the year 1517, he nails to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg something that's become famous for Christendom throughout the world, known as the 95 Theses, which criticizes the Catholic Church's primarily its sale of indulgences. This was a big moneymaker for the church, and something that the church had been divided on for a long time. You could buy these indulgences to allow you to sin, and sort of you get a break, and you can pay for forgiveness from the church, so you don't go to hell for all your whoring about or whatever it is that you're asking for the indulgence. I mean, the whole thing was crazy. But nevertheless, within a few years, because of all this guy's nudging, he was excommunicated in 1521 by Pope Leo X. He was given an opportunity after that to defend his beliefs. He will later go on to translate the New Testament into German. The language of the Bible was a very big issue for Christians. They relied upon the Vulgate entirely, which was a Latin translation. And that also did, to a very certain extent, contribute to some of the anti-Semitism, because it meant that they were only hearing the parts of the Bible, they were only entitled to hear the parts of the Bible, the normal people, that the church wanted read to them. And as we know, many of those were from some of the most anti-Jewish segments of the Bible. At any rate, all kinds of events happened during this time. The word Protestant begins to emerge, related to the word protest. All through this period, this early period, let me get my share up. All through this early period, Martin Luther developed this idea that the Jews might indeed not be as bad as they seem, because it may be that if they would only meet the good Christian religion, they would have had their eyes open. And he wants to blame the terrible condition of the Jews and the terrible conditions created by Jews, he was an anti-Semite, on what he believed was Jewish opposition to the Catholic Church. He wrote this early on in his career. I don't have it on this text here, just a little short thing. The Jews are blood relations of our Lord. The Jews are related to Jesus. If it were proper to boast of flesh and blood, which you can't really do that, you're not allowed to do that, the Jews belong more to Christ than we do. I beg, therefore, my dear papist, if you become tired of abusing me as a heretic, that you begin to revile me as a Jew. Now, that's a pretty interesting statement. Here's this guy, very influential in the world at that time, in the religious world, saying, I'm a Jew. Now, he's assuming a great deal on the part of the Jews. But you could see this might have been a little nick in anti-Semitism, but it really did not turn out to be that. Within a few years, it was very clear to him that Jews were not going to willingly convert to Christianity. And this being Central Europe, they were not willing to do, and they were not doing what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula that was already well underway and would continue for a couple hundred years, which was the combination of the forcible conversion, the forced conversions, the expulsions, and then the whole business of the Inquisition, the auto de fe, public renunciations of heresy. That's something that Martin Luther did not want to happen. He thought if he simply stripped out all the crap from Christianity, he'd have some allies here, and that would end Jew hatred. By 1543, it was clear this was not going to be his main way forward. And we're going to read this because he wrote a whole pamphlet about it, a little booklet called On the Jews and Their Lies. And he released this in 1543. So you can see just in a short amount of time, a little over a decade and a half, where he had landed. And he says this: I had made up my mind to write no more either about the Jews or against them. But since I have learned that those miserable and accursed people do not cease to lure to themselves even us, that is, the Christians, I have published this little book so that I might be found among those who oppose such poisonous activities of the Jews and who warn the Christians to be on their guard against them. Now, keep in mind, there was no mass conversion going on of Christians, whether they were Protestant sympathizers or Catholics, by Jews. This was simply a way to join the bandwagon. He goes on to write, I would not have believed that a Christian could be duped by the Jews into taking their exile and wretchedness upon himself. However, the devil is the god of the world, and wherever God's word is absent, he has an easy task, not only with the weak, but also with the strong. May God help us. Amen. Now, what's he doing here? He's saying that Catholicism is so horrible that any Catholic can be drawn over. Now, keep in mind, we don't have a Protestant church at this time. Everybody's a Catholic. We have protesting Catholics and we have other Catholics. There's no Church of Germany or Protestant Church or any of these names that they took on. We don't even have a Church of England yet. And even when we get a Church of England, it really at first has very little to do, well, at least for King Henry, it had very, very little to do with theology, nothing to do with Jews, because there were none. So he goes on to say, it is not my purpose to quarrel with the Jews, nor to learn from them how they interpret or understand Scripture. I know all of that very well already, much less do I propose to convert the Jews, for that is impossible. They have failed to learn any lesson from the terrible distress that has been theirs for over 1,400 years in exile. Nor can they obtain any end or definite terminus of this, as they suppose, by means of the vehement cries and laments to God. If these blows do not help, it is reasonable to assume that our talking and explaining will help even less. And here you begin to dive into the same tropes that appear time after time. The stubbornness, the controlling, the fact that they're demons, they serve Satan, they serve the devil. These are common tropes aimed against Jews throughout time. And they're very unique. Therefore, a Christian should be content and not argue with the Jews. But if you ever want to talk with them, do not say any more than this. Listen, Jew, are you aware that Jerusalem and your sovereignty, together with your temple and priesthood, have been destroyed for over 1,460 years? For this year, which we Christians write as the year 1542, since the birth of Christ, is exactly 1,468 years, going on 1,500 years, since Vespasian and Titus destroyed Jerusalem and expelled the Jews from the city. Let the Jews bite on this nut and dispute this question as long as they wish. All I can say that's good about this is at least he acknowledges that we had a temple. Now, the new anti-Semitism, we didn't even apparently have anything to do with Israel. But that's another story. For such ruthless wrath of God is sufficient evidence that they assuredly have erred and gone astray. Even a child can comprehend this. For one dare not regard God as so cruel that he would punish his own people so long, so terribly, so unmercifully, and in addition keep silent, comforting them neither with words nor with deeds, and fixing no time limit and no end to it. This is a lovely guy. When you go by a Lutheran church, you should always keep in mind there are two kinds of Lutherans. The ones who pretend he didn't say this, and the other ones who don't pretend he didn't say this, but are also very religiously conservative. In short, as has already been said, do not engage much in debate with Jews about the articles of our faith. From their youth, they have been so nurtured with venom and rancor against our Lord that there is no hope until they reach the point where their misery finally makes them pliable, and they are forced to confess that the Messiah has come and that he is our Jesus. Until such a time, it is much too early, yes. It is useless to argue with them about how God is triune, the Trinity, how he became man, and how Mary is the mother of God. No human reason nor any human heart will ever grant these things, much less the embittered, venomous, blind heart of the Jews. I find it interesting that he cites the least common sense things you could teach anybody. I mean, the idea of a resurrected human that's God and all that. Jews were wise not to believe that. I'm not saying all our beliefs traditionally were wise, but that one right there, those were way off the wall. There's one thing about which they boast and pride themselves beyond measure, and that is their descent from the foremost people on earth, from Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, from the 12 patriarchs, and thus from the holy people of Israel. They boast of being the noblest, yes, the only noble people on earth. In comparison with them and in their eyes, we Gentiles, Goyim, are not human. In fact, we hardly deserve to be considered poor worms by them. Now, this was not untrue. The Jews didn't love the Gentiles who had been persecuting them all this time, but this was a way sort of them ennobling themselves. And it was something that was very common. Jews looked at themselves as being better than others because they were being treated so much worse than everyone. And there were no other minority communities. There were minorities here and there, you would see them, but there were no minority communities in Europe other than the Jews. To strut before God and boast about being so noble, so exalted, so rich compared to other people, that is devilish arrogance. Think about how many times you've heard this as one of the other themes, tropes of anti-Semitism. Since every birth according to the flesh is condemned before him without exception. That's original sin. Learn from this, dear Christian, what you were doing if you permit the blind Jews to mislead you. Then the saying will truly apply: when a blind man leads a blind man, both of them will fall into the pit. That's a paraphrase of Luke, the New Testament. You cannot learn anything from them except how to misunderstand the divine commandments. Therefore, be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues, nothing is found but a den of devils in which sheer self-glory, conceit, lies, blasphemy, and defaming of God and men are practiced most maliciously. Where you see or hear a Jew teaching, remember that you are hearing nothing but a venomous basilisk, it's a snake, who poisons and kills people merely by fasting. Be on your guard against them. Just has to get his teeth into you and your history. The example of the Jews demonstrates clearly how easily the devil can mislead people after they once have digressed from the proper understanding of Scripture into such blindness and darkness that it can be readily grasped and perceived simply by natural reason, yes, even by irrational beasts. And yet they who daily teach and hear God's word do not recognize this darkness, but regard it as the true light. O Lord God, have mercy on us. Yes, Ron. You're still muted, though. And now I don't see you anymore.
There we go. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. My question is mainly why. You pointed out at the very beginning, was there a possible opening? Was there a possibility of being, avoiding the Christian animus against the Jews, especially because he was taking on the entire church hierarchy? And clearly, he's not doing that. He's simply going on with something else, or maybe with greater strength than before at that moment. What has been written about this? What is going on that there is such venom here?
So a couple of things that I've read, and the way I understand it, are a few things. One, he really did, I think, believe at the beginning that the Jews, because they were related to Christ, he distanced himself from that statement. Yeah. But that is the ultimate problem here with Christianity and the Jews. I mean, that's sort of the womb out of which comes all of this certain kind of vitriol, this weird hatred of the Jews and the weird ways of doing it. So he, for a moment, believes it's the church's fault, because the church, it's so corrupt, it's so meaningless to people. It's got to be that the Jews see this. There's nothing here that could possibly convince them. And then, of course, he realizes he's wrong. The Jews have no interest in Christianity. They're not going to be interested in Christianity because they think it's wrong. And also because they've been mistreated by Christians. So now, why does he then lay it on so thick? I mean, he could have just walked away, right?
Yes.
Why does he lay it on so thick? Number one, I think there's a genuine disappointment here. Number two, I think that there's really a very, very strong and overwhelming I don't want to say inbred, but cultural anti-Semitism that is very hard to escape right now. I mean, we're seeing it. We had the discussions about is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Well, maybe not in the universities, maybe not where you're having a genteel conversation about the whole thing about nationalisms and so forth. But lately, as I've demonstrated, I think very clearly, and it comes out even more every day, what we're seeing is that it's really becoming a euphemism for the Jews by the hoi polloi, by the people who just really don't like Jews, and Israel reminds them of all the reasons they don't. And you have this is the cultural context of it. If we can say that racism of the American type is baked into every one of us who lives as a white person, which I believe because of our culture. Well, you can't deny that at his point, 1400 years of this is there. So it's disappointment, it's that. And one more thing, too. I don't think you make a lot of followers as a Protestant by praising the Jews. That's never going to happen. And because he's a legitimate reformer, he is never going to force Jews to convert. This has to be willing. And the only reason they're not willing is that they're of the devil. You will not make friends among the people you're looking to follow. So those are the 5 things that I put in my notes, little reasons that I think he went off so much based on a few things I'd read here and there. Jacob Rader Marcus, I think, mostly of blessed memory. So anyway, that's what I'll offer there. We're not going to spend a lot more time in the Protestant Reformation. Just know that things kind of went apace there for Christians and Jews, but other things would happen in Europe. And here's where chronology is really going to take a big bite or a big, it's going to take a big fall, because we're going to have to look at Europe in different places and understand what happened in different places based on things that changed in Europe. And I'm going to rely on Ron from time to time to correct any history that I get wrong, because this is of the more this is of the more confusing history in many ways. We're going to look at the Enlightenment. We're going to look at the emancipation of the Jews. It was not a very smooth road. There are just dozens and hundreds of historical little crossroads where these things meet. Then we're going to head over to Eastern Europe, where something entirely different is happening. And it's not that it's unrelated to what's happening in Western Europe, but for the Jews, it's experienced very differently. We're going to look at the rise of nationalism. We're going to peek a little bit into the sort of the resurrection of anti-Semitism in places like France that had kind of given the appearance that they were done with it. And then we're going to continue all around that horn, as they say in baseball. I'm sorry, I had to remute you so I could keep the green box around me on the but you can unmute yourself if anybody has a question. You can always do that. All right, so let's talk about the Age of Enlightenment. It would seem that anti-Semitism, particularly of the religious variety, would show signs of weakening with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, of course, is also going to slowly but surely lead to the emancipation of Jews throughout Central and Western Europe. Now, ironically, the majority of the Jews do not live in Central or Western Europe. The vast majority of the Jews have long left Western and Central Europe, where they were mostly thrown out of and have only trickled back because of the expulsions that we read about. And the largest Jewish population on earth is in Eastern Europe, from Lithuania, Russia, all the way to Ukraine. The Lithuanian, Polish, I don't know what you call it, empire, I suppose, all the way down to Ukraine, into Russia, and then also, pushing at the borders of Germany. The further east in Germany, the more likely this is to be to have more Jews there. But again, you have all these different restrictions on different places. But Germany is the site of a lot of the Enlightenment, a lot of the emancipation. And remember, when we say emancipation, we're talking about the reality of the Jews, that they were never citizens anywhere. None of that has changed here. It doesn't have to be all about hate all the time, although it is. It's also just the debilitation of basic human rights, to be a citizen, to have redress with the government, to have, not that these were democracies, but they did have courts. They did have other places where a citizen could be heard. Jews always, amongst each other, they could address their own courts, but when addressing a Gentile or being addressed by a Gentile, they couldn't. That was a big problem for them. But anyway, I do think it's important to point out there ain't a lot of Jews here. But of course, the emancipation and the Enlightenment, probably more accurately, is going to spread. It's going to spread to the Americas. It's going to spread east, mostly on the bayonet of Napoleon, but also in many people's values too. And by the 17th century, Jews were being readmitted to certain places. Already in the 1600s, Jews were in the 1500s. Jews were being admitted to the Netherlands, which was kind of a quasi-republic, right? And we're establishing communities there. I mentioned them before. That novel, The Weight of Ink, which is a great fun novel to read, will give you some insight into where Spinoza lived, but it's also a reminder that there were Ashkenazi Jews there too. After Cromwell came to power, he let the Jews start coming back for similar reasons that the kings before him had. He wanted their creativity and stuff, and he was not particularly anti-Semitic. The British are known for both being smotheringly philo-Semitic and also extraordinarily anti-Semitic. Depends on which Brit you're talking about. It was a very, very small community, but it did reestablish itself. That's a fun thing about that book too, by Rachel Kadish, I think is her name. The English community was among the freest, and they were already beginning to give more emancipation, and even by the 19th century, the right to vote and so forth. France was, of course, its own thing, because France is where the cradle of Enlightenment was in many ways, and there were Jews there still, and Jews had come back. But even the desire and conversation about emancipating Jews there came with its own anti-Semitic baggage. Enlightenment thinkers, and as humanistic Jews, were very attached to the Enlightenment, right? I think Sherwin must have written 4,000 essays on it. Enlightenment thinkers, though, took very little interest in Jews, either as a religious or a social group. They often expressed unmitigated and unmistakable hostility or prejudice toward them. We're going to take a look at just the writings of one and some of the sayings of one fella that we're all familiar with, Francois-Marie Arouet. Did I say that right? Voltaire. Who saw the Jews as sort of a repository, if you will, of blind religious obedience, of unthinking observance. Listen, some of us still are. He wasn't completely wrong, but he was looking at us as a body, as a corpus of a whole people there, and decisions were being made about whether and how Jews could become part of the French nation. He also saw them as a source of what would be called scripturalism, too much adherence to the love of the text of the Bible, which they were busily rejecting, and priestcraft. So Arouet, Voltaire, was born in 1694. This I really have to read. In 1778, he's probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous, French Enlightenment writers, historians, etc. He was wickedly critical of Christianity and an advocate for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, all the things we love, et cetera, wrote a bunch of poems and novels and this and that. Individually, he had no problem with a Jew. He did not see Jews as being uniquely devilish as human beings. He did not see the Jews as any particular Jew as carrying on these characteristics. There was none of this limpieza de sangre that the Spanish Catholics had, that the Jews somehow carried with them this, I don't want to say gene, that's obviously anachronistic, but this predisposition to being dishonest and wanting to control the world and deceitful and devilish and everything else. When he wrote his anti-Jewish writings, this was not a personal thing. What he didn't care for was the Jews as a group. And by the time he had become famous, all of his anti-Jewish ideas had been set down in writing by many people. He saw the Jews as unfortunate, as a stand-in for all the negative ideas about religion and dogma. You know, there is a certain interesting aspect to Jews who remain loyal to the community because there's no enforcement structure, right? The Jews don't have a pope. The Jews don't have an inquisition. Even the one guy who most famously, so famous that a little temple in Farmington Hills named their family education program after him. Even a little guy, this Baruch Spinoza, when the Jewish community, with great ceremony, half of which they pulled out of their asses, excommunicated him, which really meant, you know, for Christians, it's you can't come to communion. That means you have to go to hell. For Jews, it means you're out of the community, which, you know, can also be a kind of heaven for some Jews. So, and some have written, and I've read a lot of biographies of Spinoza. Some believe that he really was quite happy to get the hell away from those people. I doubt that, though, because it was what would hurt was the family part. I was just recently reading a story about how being cut off from family and being given the silent treatment is actually quite torturous for people. And he had nowhere to go. And his whole life then was a lot of grinding lenses to make a living and renting a small room, which, by the way, probably killed him because that glass dust gets in your lungs, and he died very young. And the rest of it was, you know, writing letters back and forth, rejecting or being rejected for different kinds of ideas and this and that. But he was a great world-class philosopher. Don't ask me to explain his the book that he wrote that was published posthumously, but the book he wrote about freedoms and the Torah and everything else, you could pick that up tomorrow and read it. You don't have to be a great philosopher. I understand that one very easily, the theological, political treatise that he wrote. In any case, why then would Jews stay together? They stayed together because they really believed in the power of community. They were not really forced to. And later, as emancipation sets in, ironically, they start converting. Now, some of it is opportunistic, because just because you're emancipated doesn't mean suddenly, you know, you're welcome in everybody's clubs and you can get a job at any university or, you know, you name it. That was not the case. And so people were converting right and left, but many didn't even bother converting. You couldn't be nothing even after emancipation. That's a whole different discussion and a different class. But what were you going to be after emancipation had yet to be determined at this point in the 18th century, at least in Europe. It was not clear. So we're going to just take a look. This is a collection that was put together by a guy I don't know, and passed on to me by a teacher that I did know. Just a few little bon mots of Voltaire, but honestly, it reflects so many other attitudes towards the Jews. He wrote, "They are all of them born with raging fanaticism in their hearts." Now, this does seem a little racialized, but I think he means it from a communal way, even though he says it in a racialized way. Just as the Bretons or Germans are born with blonde hair, I would not be in the least surprised if these people would not someday become deadly to the human race. The Jewish nation dares to display an irreconcilable hatred toward all nations and revolts against all masters. Now, notice he doesn't say the Jew. He says the Jewish nation. Always superstitious, always greedy for well-being enjoyed by others, always barbarous, cringing in misfortune, and insolent in prosperity. If you think about this hard, though, and you take away the kind of meanness in it, think about Reform Judaism. What was its main thrust from the 1820s and 30s when it was established all the way into the 20th century? Its main thrust was to denationalize the Jews. It was also, by the way, its main failure. We can talk about whether it's right or not, or this or that, but it never worked. It never worked. But having been ordained at and grown up in a reform movement that was already in the middle to late 20th century, I still could see the remnants of it around me. They weren't mean like Voltaire, but they were capturing the same idea, which is the Jew does not have to have a home. The home of the Jew is anywhere the Jew lives. And the Jew doesn't have to be viewed as a nation. It's a religion. And this didn't work for Sherwin Wine, but it also didn't work for the rest of Reform Judaism. And anybody ever wonder why the school I was ordained from has two names? The Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. I used to add International House of Pancakes just for fun, because why not? It's because in the 1920s, Stephen Wise, leading a large group of very nationalist Jews, Zionist Jews, decided that he was done with HUC, and he established the Jewish Institute of Religion. The two came together in the 1940s and were reunited. And that's why we have two names. The Jewish Institute of Religion was in New York. The Hebrew Union College was in Cincinnati, and they didn't talk to each other. And it was all because of this. They agreed on everything else. On another occasion, according to the person who compiled this, Voltaire charged that the Jew does not belong any place except that place which he makes money. Would he not just as easily betray the king on behalf of the emperor as he would the emperor for the king? I don't know that these are legitimate quotes, by the way, but it doesn't matter, because these are the kinds of things that he inspired. There is a small question mark that as I was re-preparing this for the fourth time, I began to question, because I looked up, I couldn't find some of these quotes. Now, these I believe are, and I don't know, Ron, you might know better than I, but these are apparently things that come from his essays in the Dictionary of Philosophy, where he calls Jews our masters and enemies whom we detest, the most abominable people in the world. He says, if we read the history of the Jews written by an author of another nation, we would have sorrow to believe that they were indeed fugitive people of Egypt, which came by express order from God into 7 or 8 small nations that they didn't know, to cut the throat without mercy of a woman, old man, and children with the udder, and to reserve only the small girls, that these holy people were punished of his God, when it had been enough criminal to save only one man devoted to the anathema. Okay, I think we're just gonna skip down, because what I wanted to do was not to disparage Voltaire, although I believe there's a lot of legitimate quotes here, but to give you the idea that the Enlightenment individuals had their own problems with the Jews. But again, I believe that it was very much the Jews of the collective variety than it was any independent Jew. What was so interesting is that the Jews didn't hate Voltaire. They liked Voltaire. The Jews of France and other places in the West, and even in the East where they knew something of what was going on, wrote him adoring letters. And ultimately, he came to describe, as others did, the policy of Enlightenment in France as, to the Jews as individuals, everything; to the Jews as a people, nothing. Go ahead, Ron. Don't forget to unmute. No, you're still muted. You can just hold your space bar down. And
I'm okay. No, I'm okay. I keep forgetting. Isn't it more than some sort of irrational prejudice on his part, or hostility to the Jewish people or individuals on his part? Isn't it more a matter of the fact that he's dealing with, what's the essence here? The Jews are a religion, and as a religion, and this could be as true of Reform Judaism today in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, as it is all non-humanistic Judaisms today, that there's this attachment to an irrational set of beliefs that can't be enlightened, number one, and two, shape and form the essence of the community. If I'm Voltaire looking at that at the time, I can say, yes, I can reason with this or that individual, but the community itself is based on, after all, is based on a religious faith. And that's what I'm looking into, exploring, dissolving on behalf of a reason. Isn't his attitude the same as, let's put it more sharply, your attitude, so to speak, towards theistic Jews? Except with
no, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. Yes and no. Obviously, I read the quotes that said exactly what you're saying. He views them as being a problem religiously. And the fact that they are still not in any way integrated into larger society and live in a kind of way that's very, priestcraft, if you will, very much about obeying the word of scripture and, the casuistry and all of that. All of that, by the way, is going to be 100% questioned by Jews it's already at this time being questioned by Jews. It's not quite there yet. It's Mendelssohn primarily, and in Germany, but within 20 years, 30 years, it's going to be Jews asking the same questions about Judaism. But then the issue arises, what then is Judaism? What does it mean to be a Jew? If it's not a religion, it's got to be something. And this is where the French also have an issue with the Jews. They're not sure that the Jews can be Frenchmen because they're now Jews. They're just Jews. And Jews are a nation. Jews view themselves as a nation always. The fact that we have forgotten that, this was a very big thing, by the way, for Sherwin Wine. When he rejects the theism, what's he left with? Mm-hmm. A bunch of cultural customs, most of which he doesn't observe. He calls it a family. He likens it. He's a little bit wary of Kaplanian claims of civilization, but he doesn't hate it. But he talks about the Jewish family, the Jewish tribe a little bit. It's a pretty tribalistic analysis, by the way, that Sherwin makes. It's not a genetic tribalistic analysis, but no Jew ever did that. We've always looked at ourselves as being pre that. We're so ancient. So there's two worries that Voltaire has. The one is this religiosity. The Jews are dealing with that. Moses Mendelssohn is dealing with that in Germany. He is absolutely coming to terms with that. Well, by the way, he wasn't the first Reformed Jew. He was he was quite the traditionalist. His grandson, of course, is the more famous Mendelssohn, who we can hum tunes to, and he wound up converting away, but for opportunistic reasons, so that he could get work here and there, not because he didn't have citizenship. Moses Mendelssohn was admired, but he was also hated by a lot of Jews. He had many more fans among non-Jews than Jews. The Jews who were more like him just left the religion. They didn't want to be traditional like him. And he had come up with all these very practical, he was the first modern Orthodox Jew in some ways. And though he's not given the credit for that. And the Jews who cared about being Jewish didn't want anything to do with him. And his reforms were minor. Oh, let's put a translation of the Bible in German so the kids can read it. Or let's put it in German characters so they can at least understand the Hebrew. But the Jews who wanted to stay Jewish, that was a religious thing. And that's who Voltaire is looking down his nose at on one hand. But then he's looking down his nose on the other hand. We've got a lot of noses and hands going on here for me. But he's looking down his nose on the other hand at the fact that this is a nation. They've always understood themselves as a nation. When Reform Judaism tries to divorce the nationhood from the Jew, it winds up being it's a debacle. What brought the Jews back into the fold of nationhood? Why is Reform Judaism? We're having a discussion at our congregation where we've decided to have a civil discussion about Israel and the Hamas war, right? There are people on both sides. But the one thing that's not going to change, at least under my, leadership or guidance, we're not going to start putting up all kinds of symbols everywhere. But the symbols aren't what makes us a nation. It's the bonds that we feel with each other. The Reform movement has an official statement saying that it is a Zionist movement.
Mm-hmm.
Because they failed when they couldn't do that. They were on their way out the door. Jews want to feel that way. Most of our Jews in humanistic Judaism too. We stay away from the Z word for some people, but it's a tiny number of people. Just because we don't want all the fighting doesn't seem to prevent it anyway when a war breaks out, but that's another story. We can't get away from this. And Sherwin absolutely never got away from it. He wrote a lot of essays about why he was a Zionist. He thought Zionism was one of the greatest things ever. And he was quite critical of Israeli policy. He's still a very good role model for people who want to learn how to do both. Voltaire didn't want that. He wanted them to be French, period. The Reform Jews who came to America from Bohemia and other places in Western and Central Europe, about really not more than 60 years later, this is not a long amount of time, and did not come escaping anti-Semitism, by the way. Those Jews came over here because they wanted to be Americans.
Yeah.
They wanted to emancipate. But when they got here, they realized that even in America, you were still going to be a Jew. And so what did they do? They found other ways to be Jews. And then when the Eastern Europeans came over and flooded the Reform movement, eventually, very quickly, within a generation, they brought it from this highfalutin neo-Kantian kind of, rational religion that two rabbis that I know that are 98 and 99 still mourn, and brought it into, all of the ethnic stuff and the racial stuff, or the nationhood stuff, which is really the proper way to put it. So that's why I say this. You're right on one count, but on the other, and I'm going to show you why I think that, because Napoleon had the same question. And Napoleon was encountering a lot of Jews because, he was moving into their neighborhoods. And so what I wanted to move to, of course, when the Republic of, I haven't seen the movie about Napoleon. I'm sure it's terrible, but I still want to see it. They never made a good movie about Napoleon. I just think it'd be fun to see him come to life. Anybody see that? I just think it'd be fun to watch him put the crown on his head, like in the painting. But he brought what he considered to be the Enlightenment, as he understood. He brought it to a lot of areas, into Germany and elsewhere. And in 1807, at exactly the time that the Jews were dealing with this issue in all the places that they were living in the West and central parts of Europe, and even to a certain extent had brought with them to America, there was no significant Jewish population in America, by the way, during these years. We've had 3 waves of Jewish immigration here. The first one was in the 17th century, when the small Jewish community of Recife, Brazil, was thrown out. That wave consisted of 23 Jews. And it grew into the Portuguese Sephardic population that was in place at the time of the Revolution. And then it just went away. It assimilated itself out of existence. It's very, very difficult to be a community of that many people in this new country. But they were there. And who picked up? It was the Central European Jews. They picked up the mantle. That's why, even though they were a tiny little group, it's so important to study them, because they basically are the founders of Western Judaism, even though they didn't really do it where they were, and ultimately they were all destroyed where they were or fled. And then the next big one was in the 1880s, which is where almost all of us who came from Jewish families have, if not 100%, at least 75% of our heritage, of our background. I had one grandmother who went back to the 1850s, 1860s, and 3 grandparents that were Eastern European and had come in the 1880s, 90s, 1910s, and 20s. Okay, so when we read these questions, we have to understand that we're talking about small groups of people, but extraordinarily important questions. So Napoleon wanted to know whether the Jews were going to be Frenchmen or citizens of the place where they were, or whether they were going to be a nation unto themselves. And the people he appointed came up with these questions. And we may just, I don't know how much we'll get through them. But I want you to think about these questions through the lens, not of religion per se, or not only of religion, but of national status. Usually in an anti-Semitism class, I don't do this much in emancipation, but I wanted to because this is the original class ended on a happy note. This one is going to unfortunately end on a very unhappy note because we're going a little bit longer, and we're going to go back to Eastern Europe, which I glossed over last time. So here's his questions to this Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was an ancient rabbinical court. He reestablishes the Sanhedrin. He calls together notable leaders of Jewish communities in various places, mostly Germany. Is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? In other words, can you break the law of monogamy? He doesn't really care if it's lawful. As it turns out, Jews can have more than one wife, but not in Europe. Already in approximately the year 1000, when the Central European Jewish population was super tiny, its religious founder, Rabbeinu Gershom, put a 1,000-year ban. It just expired, but it was extended by a whole bunch of nonsense. 1,000-year ban on polygamy in Europe, in European Jews. But they had it. There were Jews from Yemen who came in the 1940s and 50s to Israel who came with more than one wife. Israel does not allow polygamy anymore. So this wasn't a religious question. This was a legal question. Is divorce allowed in the Jewish religion? And if it is it allowed even in contradiction of the codes of French law? As it turns out, it is, and it would have been allowed in contradiction to French codes of French law. There, as it happens, they were able to answer a lot of these questions with the reliance upon a rule that came from the Talmud. Anybody know what that rule is? It's an Aramaic phrase, Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. Whatever the law of the land in which you're living is, it absolutely pushes aside any religious law. There are only 3 exceptions. They can't force you to commit heresy. They can't force you to commit murder, and they can't force you to commit incest. Incest, murder, and heresy, you don't obey those laws. But anything else, and by the way, they're the same law for Shabbat. You can violate Shabbat, you can violate kashrut, you can violate any law for pikuach nefesh. Did you know this? Do you know what pikuach nefesh is? The saving of a human life. And there's arguments among the rabbis, it's just a Jewish life. It came down to any life. Ultimately, it came down to any life. The rabbi said, look, if we only do it to the Jews, they're going to hate us. So little did they know, they were going to hate you anyway. But it was still a more moral way to do it. But you can't commit heresy, you can't commit incest, and you can't commit murder. As you know, as to even to save a human life, according to Jewish law. Does Jewish law permit a Jewess to marry a Christian man, or a Jew to marry a Christian woman, or may they marry only other Jews? Well, sounds like a straightforward question. Does Jewish law allow a Jewish woman to marry a Christian man, or vice versa? Well, no, actually, it's not forbidden. It's forbidden for a non-Jew and a Jew to enter into an agreement that is covered by a ketubah. That's what's forbidden. Because a ketubah is an agreement between 2 Jews, and they explained it this way. But they said, we can't do anything to stop a Christian man from marrying a Jewish girl or vice versa. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen who are not Jewish considered to be their brethren or strangers? Do you want to be French or don't you? Think about what that means. What type of conduct does Jewish law prescribe toward non-Jewish Frenchmen? To the Jews who are born in France and have been granted citizenship by the laws of France, truly acknowledge France as their country. This is what they wanted to know. Are you bound to defend it, to follow its laws, to follow directions of the civil and court authorities of France? We had a situation during World War I. It did not repeat itself in World War II. In World War I, where Jews were on both sides, the Germans and the Americans and British. There were plenty of German Jews who were fighting, just as there were plenty of Christians who were fighting on the other side of that war, because they had determined that Judaism was their private religion, and being a German was what they cared, what was their nationality. And we have all adopted that, except that we have this idea of Zionism being legitimate. Most Jews do. So it seems like, according to the Pew polls, it's 80 to 90%. They just ran a new poll, and it looked like it's close to 90% with more sophisticated questions being asked. That, you know, that kind of idea that there's not a loyalty to another country, not an obedience to another country. There was no other country here, so it was even easier. Who elects the rabbis? Because they thought of them as judges. What kind of judicial power do rabbis exercise over the Jews? Well, it had always been that Jews went to a rabbi in a dispute with another Jew. It was a legal thing. By the way, that still happens in America. And American courts permit it the way they permit all kinds of other, extrajudicial litigations and what's the word I'm thinking of? Mediations and so forth. And yeah, rabbis can be mediators. If there is rabbinical jurisdiction of the Jews, is it regulated by the laws of the Jewish religion, or is it merely a custom existing among Jews? Well, it was regulated by the Jewish religion, but as it happened, they were able to answer that the Jewish religion says we're subservient to the courts of the land, and always had. This is a 2,000-year-old rabbinical dictum from the Talmud. Does Jewish law prohibit Jews from taking usury from other Jews? Kind of, not entirely. Does Jewish law prohibit Jews from taking usury from non-Jews? Hell no. But they already knew the answers to those questions. So, all right, so we'll stop here. This is a good place to stop. What we're going to do next week is look at the first emancipation that really was an emancipation, which was Prussia in 1812. And then we're going to just tiptoe across the border and go back in time to visit Eastern Europe. And we have to go way back in time to about the 13th or 14th century, because Eastern Europe, for all the fanciness of all these discussions here, 80% of the Jews on earth are living at this time in Eastern Europe. The Sephardic world is tiny. The other parts of the world are tiny. But before we go to Eastern Europe, I'm going to give you, this is where we used to end the class. I want to read a very nice thing so we can all have patriotic fervor as Americans. And the reason I ended with George Washington is because I always, when I taught this class 2 times before here and in Miami, it was a limited number of sessions, much more so than now, and it always ended right before July 4th. So I was getting really patriotic about it. But I think it's worth reading and remembering that there was an exception, at least for Jews in this country.